A 7-year-old boy refuses to sleep in his own room, insisting on guarding his little sister every night, terrified of what lurks in the shadows. At first, his parents think it's just childish fear, until the father sets up a camera and sees something no parent should ever witness. Listen to today's story until the end, because the truth is far more terrifying than any nightmare. Also, let us know where you're listening from. In the sleepy outskirts of Cold Hollow, Vermont, nestled among whispering pines and tangled lilac bushes, stood a weathered wooden house. The Whitaker family had lived here for 3 years. David, a practical man working as a factory electrician, his wife Karen, a part-time nurse at a rural clinic, and their 2 children, 7-year-old Ethan and 3-year-old Lily. Their lives were simple, filled with small-town rhythms and peaceful evenings spent watching the sun bleed across the treetops. But all of that changed the night Ethan began refusing to sleep in his own room. It began with a whisper, Ethan asking to sleep in Lily's room, saying he heard footsteps. David brushed it off as childish fear. But when Ethan insisted, night after night, and began sleeping curled up on the floor beside Lily's crib, the tension in the household grew thicker with each passing evening. What started as an occasional request soon became a non-negotiable routine. David began losing patience, while Karen's concern deepened. The soft creaks of the floorboards, the subtle hush in Ethan's tone, everything felt heavier, as though an unseen weight had settled into their home. Karen tried to soothe her husband's irritation. It's just a phase, she said. But David couldn't shake the feeling something was wrong. Ethan grew pale, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. Sometimes, he'd stare at the dark corners of the room too long, as if listening to something no one else could hear. One night, David demanded Ethan sleep in his own bed. Hours later, Lily's terrified cries shattered the silence. In the dead of night, David rushed into the room and froze at the sight before him. Lily was standing in her crib, face streaked with tears. Ethan stood rigidly in front of her, as if shielding her from some unseen force. His eyes were wide, unblinking, locked on a darkened corner of the room. "Please, Dad. Let me stay," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible but carrying a weight that felt far too old for a 7-year-old boy. There was no defiance in his tone, only desperation and something that felt eerily like fear laced with duty. David relented, but he stayed up, uneasy, staring into the shadows where Ethan's gaze had landed. The air felt heavy. That night, sleep never came. Determined to uncover the truth, David installed an old factory security camera in the children's room. The next day, he watched the footage. At 2:17 a.m., something moved, a shadow sliding from the ventilation grate toward Lily's crib. Ethan sat up, shielded his sister with his small body, and stayed frozen until it disappeared. David's blood ran cold. Haunted, David visited the Cold Hollow Archives, a musty building nestled behind the town's old church, filled with dusty tomes and forgotten histories. There, he was introduced to Dr. Peter Marshall, a historian whose knowledge of Cold Hollow's obscure past ran deeper than most dared to investigate. Dr. Marshall listened closely as David recounted the strange events. After a long pause, he pulled out a fragile, leather-bound ledger from the 1800s and opened it to a faded page. He revealed that the Whitaker home had been built on the ruins of the long-lost Blackwood estate. In the 19th century, the Blackwood family had been known for their wealth, but also for a string of chilling tragedies. Nearly every child born into the family died under mysterious circumstances. Some disappeared entirely without a trace. Dr. Marshall's voice grew quieter. There were others, he said, neighbors who tried to stop them, the Winslows. But after one of their sons vanished, the entire family disappeared not long after. Their farmhouse was found abandoned, table set for dinner, doors unlocked. It was like they had just ceased to be. David left the archives with a heavy heart. The past hadn't died. It had simply waited, and now it had returned. That night, the entity returned, whispering, scratching. The shadows moved like smoke. David reached out to Father Gabriel, an elderly priest in a mountaintop monastery. "This is old evil," the priest warned. "You may not defeat it, but you can contain it." Armed with holy water, blessed candles, and prayer, David performed a cleansing. It failed. Shadows coiled around him, mocking his every word. The air grew bitterly cold, and a whisper curled through the room. David's hands trembled as he clutched the last of the candles. With no other choice, he doused the house in gasoline. Then he dropped the flame. David stood outside, eyes burning with tears, watching the house collapse under the weight of what it had harbored. He didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He simply watched it all burn. The Whitakers relocated to Maple Hollow Cabin, a hunting lodge in the northern woods. Peace was brief. Lily began whispering to an unseen sister. Turns out, the entity had latched onto Lily and not the previous property. Ethan stood guard each night. David fortified the cabin with symbols, candles, and chalk circles. But one night the figure appeared again, outside the window. Long-limbed, faceless. It couldn't enter, but it was watching. Back in town, Peter Marshall uncovered an ancient symbol used by the Winslows to bind evil. David recreated it with chalk, meticulously copying the intricate lines he'd seen in the historian's book. He placed the symbol near an old rusted ventilation shaft, exactly where he believed the last lingering trace of the Blackwoods still clung to this world. He completed the ritual, whispering the ancient prayer Peter Marshall had unearthed in a crumbling manuscript. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, the lights flickered. David stood his ground, heart pounding, ready for a retaliation that never came. But nothing emerged. That night, Lily slept undisturbed for the first time in weeks. No whispering, no cold, no laughter in the shadows. Just the slow, peaceful rise and fall of her breath. And David finally allowed himself to believe they might be free. Weeks passed. The air felt lighter. Ethan smiled again. But David knew better than to relax. He wrote everything in a journal, for whoever came next. Then one day, while driving back from town, David spotted a figure standing deep in the woods. It was tall, unmoving, cloaked in shadow. It wasn't the stance of a passerby or hiker. It was too still, too deliberate. It stood between the trees like it had always been there, like it belonged to the forest itself. David's grip on the steering wheel tightened. A strange pressure filled the air, like the quiet before a storm. When he blinked and looked again, the figure was gone. But the unease remained, coiled in his gut like smoke that wouldn't clear. Weeks later, a package arrived on their doorstep, wrapped in brown paper, the handwriting on the label unfamiliar but unmistakably intentional. Inside was a hand-carved wooden plaque bearing the words, "The Whitaker Home, light is stronger than darkness." The letters were etched deep, no signature. But David knew it was from Peter. It wasn't just a gift. It was a closure, a silent blessing, a way of marking the end of something terrible and the beginning of something new. That night, the family gathered by the fire, the warmth flickering across their faces. Karen leaned into David's shoulder, Lily nestled in his lap. Ethan, with newfound confidence, shared the poem he had prepared for school, verses about family, courage, and the power of love to chase away fear. The next morning, in front of classmates and strangers alike, Ethan stood on a small wooden stage and recited it word for word. His voice did not tremble. Every syllable was clear, proud, and rooted in something deeper than childhood. When the room erupted into applause, David wept openly. It was the sound of survival, of healing, of triumph. The shadows would always exist, but so would they. And that was enough. In his journal's final page, David wrote, "To the one who finds this, you are not alone. We stood here. We endured. So can you? Do you believe in such paranormal existences? And please tell us, if you were in David's place, would you have stayed to fight, or taken your family and never looked back?" Let us know your honest thoughts in the comments below, and thank you for listening to Storyline Narratives.